Tending to the Graveyard by Levi Athens. It's a shame that most people avoid graveyards. The dead deserve to be visited every once in a while. You'll spend more time there than you'll spend living anyway. It pains me to see an old graveyard fall to neglect. The one near my house is pretty much spotless. I see to that myself. That's where my father's buried. He fell ill last year and passed away only a few months ago. I've spent a long time in the graveyard since then. It can be a pretty lonely place, but I've become accustomed to it. Father always encouraged me to take a husband, but for one reason or another, it never really worked out. Loneliness is nothing new to me. One day when tending to the graveyard, I found a single mason jar on top of a grave. It was filled with what appeared to be murky rainwater, and it stunk. Assuming it was an old flower vase that had just been left out in the rain, I poured it out. I would soon learn the mistake I made. The headstone was blank on the left side. It was a couple's headstone. It must be sort of grim knowing exactly where you're going to be placed when you die, and where you'll spend the rest of eternity. That night, I had a very strange dream. It was the eeriest of sights. I saw hollowed-out people made entirely of papier-mâché. They were dancing in the sickly moonlight in elegant yet grotesque repose. These hollow people twisted and contorted in bizarre motions to the sound of a skipping record player. I awoke to find a sound coming from my living room. I climbed out of bed, curiously, cautiously, and I approached the bedroom door. I opened it slightly and peering through into the living room. I saw nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that could have made a sound. I entered the living room just to be sure, and nothing. As a lifelong lover of ghost stories, the thought of a spirit following me home from the graveyard trips had no doubt had its effects on me. Though I was determined not to let my imagination get the better of me, I returned to my bed and tried to go to sleep. A lightning storm rolled in. The rain was making its way gracefully down the bedroom window. Thunder was rumbling in the background. The storm outside began to soothe my mind with white noise, but an eerie sense came over me. I lay there motionless. I was trying to clear my thoughts. It was the feeling of somebody sinister approaching, something creepy, something lurking, closer and closer. Suddenly, a shadowy figure took shape in front of my bed. Lightning struck loudly outside the window and illuminated the room through my silky curtains. I bolted upright and I screamed in terror. The figure was a man in a dark suit, not unlike the ones they buried people in. He looked at me in a puzzled manner as if he was trying to figure out who I was or if he even recognized me. I looked back the same way. "Darling, won't you join me?" He spoke in a low voice. "Father, is that you?" I asked. With that, the figure disappeared, dissolving into the dark as though it had never been there at all. Next day, I went back to the graveyard. While I was kneeling down cleaning a tombstone, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I turned to look only to see a shadowy figure standing at the east end of the graveyard. I stood to my feet and stared back at the dark suit man in the distance. Softly, they spoke. "Won't you join me? Won't you join me here in the graveyard?" The cold wind howled across this morbid land of isolation. "There's a place for you, right here in the dirt." The man faded away into nothingness, leaving behind only the unshakable sense of dread and an impending doom. I decided that it was time for me to leave, but upon making my way to the gate exit, I noticed a young woman weeping at the foot of the couple's grave. She had long brunette hair, same shade as mine. There was a certain haunting beauty about her. Noticing me walk in her direction, she dried her eyes and she stood up. "You haven't seen a mason jar in the graveyard, have you?" she asked me. Looking down, I noticed that half the headstone was blank. This was the headstone that the mason jar had been sitting on. I explained that I had drained the contents, thinking that it was a flower pot. Her eyes widened. I instinctively, incessantly apologized, though I didn't know why pouring it out would have been wrong of me. Her gaze shifted to the graveyard behind me. From the expression on her face, I knew exactly what she was seeing. When I turned around, I saw nothing but a fading black mist and a dark silhouette. She looked at me with tears filling her eyes. I tried my best to comfort her. She told me that her husband always wanted her to be buried next to him. She reluctantly agreed. He was a miserable drunk with a really bad temper. "I've spent too many evenings staring at my future gravestone as it mocked me," she said while sobbing. The memory of her deceased husband had lingered around her, appeared to her on many occasions, asking her to come back with him to take her place beside him in the graveyard. Nothing she could do to get the haunting to cease would work, until her grandmother showed her an old family tradition, a method of banishing unwanted spirits. She showed her how to add the ingredients into a jar, and then told her to leave them on the headstone. And it worked. It all worked, until I came along. Now his spirit was back amongst the graveyard. He had mistaken me for her the first time around, but having seen her, he wasn't going to leave her alone again. Hearing this, I apologized profusely once more and immediately escorted her out of the cemetery toward my vehicle, beyond the gates. We could see the dark specter standing stoically. The figure lifted his hand, beckoning to her, beckoning her to come with him. I offered her a ride back to her place. She thankfully obliged. We went back to her house and she showed me the ingredients for the spell. Following her instructions, I helped her perform the banishing ritual and seal the contents in the jar. It was the least I could do after what I did to cause this. We returned to the graveyard and placed the jar on top of the headstone. The jar sat proudly with a silver lid on it, and a freshly applied label reading, "Do not discard." We started talking a lot after this. Her name's Maria. She works as a waitress in town. She told me a lot about the magic and her family customs. We even went out to dinner a few times together. We began hanging out on the weekends. She is truly a lovely person, someone with a lot of compassion, kindness, and a love of life. The contents of the banning ritual must be replenished from time to time, as the spell does fade. Months have passed since this all occurred, but everything seems pretty good for now. Since meeting Maria, I haven't been spending as much time alone in the graveyard, though I would make sure to visit my father's headstone pretty often. I think he would be pretty happy to know that I finally decided to marry. And I think he'd be happy to know how beautiful Maria looks in her gown. Thank you all for listening. Please like and share and do all that stuff YouTube enjoys. Leave a comment. I'm trying to get this channel remonetized. If it doesn't become remonetized, I am not exactly sure what the next step will be, but I'm not going anywhere. Thank you to all the patrons, and we'll see you in the next one.